So like for a while, like before the election, I like kind of identified more as like a, you know, I identified like very much as like a transhumanist, and like anarcho-transhumanist, and like maybe a little bit syndicalist, and like, you know, kind of like, but a lot of my feelings on things were like, oh, well, there's these systems and they're pretty horrible and they're like doing things all over the world, you know, and like I can't necessarily process all of them. So what I'm going to try to do is like focus on my like immediate center and like talk to people, you know, one by one about like, you know, politics, and like open their eyes as much as possible, and like, you know, keep things, you know, small, and, you know, figure out like a longer term. So I was like thinking more in like the, you know, 20, 30, 40, you know, years. How do I get myself and people that I care about outside of capitalism? And then use that as a platform to like go back and attack capitalism, right?
That's the DIY ethos.
Yeah, right.
Basically. I mean.
But like, you know, and like I kind of had this feeling of like, oh well, like, you know, for a while, like I had the feeling of like police are bad, but are like maybe a necessary evil, and I need to think about it. And then like, you know, I read like I was like halfway through Our Enemies in Blue when I got shot. I was listening to it.
Which is a book about how the police throughout American history.
American history. So it's Police and Power in America as the subline. It is about like the history of police in the United States. The police as an institution have like developed all over the world in different ways. Yeah. In London, they came from like, you know, they developed into the bobbies and whatever, and they were, you know, guards and things like that. In the United States, you know, New York traces its, so it claims to have the first police department and traces it back to the bobbies, but structurally they're not the same. They don't look the same, and they're like, that's a fake, like that's completely a false history.
Oh, okay.
Because like structurally there's a very clear like lineage, like evolutionary lineage from slave patrols to police, right? And that's, you know, again, where the star comes from, because slave patrols used to go out at night and like that, you know, like all of these things. Yeah. So like, so from, you know, if you look at their existence today, you look at their existence historically, what they did, right? Like they existed to disenfranchise, you know, or to make sure that there was not a slave rebellion.
Yeah.
Right. So it was targeting black folks specifically for violence and taking away weapons.
Absolutely.
I mean, and that expanded out to also targeting somewhat disenfranchised white folks, and then became the police, right? Where they basically, you know, would use this sort of like policing of, you know, make illegal anything that they, you know, that poor people or black folks would do, right? And then they'd punish that, and they'd police in targeted ways so that they could make up these statistics of, you know, basically like the statistics of you know, black crime or whatever, right? Like those original statistics come from just like basically under Jim Crow, right? Where they were where police basically came out to create those statistics, faked those statistics, so that they could then reinforce the idea that, you know, black folks were scary. Yeah. Right, and then could use that to enforce Jim Crow laws and things like that, right? And that's that mythology, right, that was created then, you know, by police that prop themselves up and, you know, whatever, has continued to this day. It's still it's still the founding mythology, right? Is scary, you know, now it's expanded, but like, you know, the drug war, right, and like scary people of color, right, is the primary excuse for the police to this day.
They create the situation which justifies their own.
But so they create the situation, and then they asymmetrically police, or they asymmetrically police, and they create laws that they can then enforce, and then they have this feedback system. Right?
So because every law, like, that's an interesting thing about the law to me, is that every case is a precedent
technically. Unless it's just like by the book, and that's why so many cases, like how many, like 90% or some, huge number of cases are plea bargains, right?
Oh yeah.
But a case that actually goes to trial, everyone has the potential to create a precedent, right?
Yeah.
And like,
there's we could just go into all kinds of depth about that. I guess this is kind of like another really interesting thing that's worthwhile to talk about, right? I was in this situation a while back, like a few years back, with this person who was like very abusive and manipulative to somebody I cared about. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I realized after kind of observing and thinking about things and like whatever is that like systems and people who are abusive will often betray the ways in which they're weak through their abuse, right? So like one of the common tactics that you see is things like saying, oh, be quiet, like don't talk about this, right? And so like all that you have to do, right? One of the ways to like get at somebody who like uses that be quiet tactic, right, is to talk about things, right? And so when you meet this thing of like, hey, we can't talk about things or we need to be quiet, right? It's very easy to be like, well, this is fucked up and I'm going to go talk about it, right? Very easy, right? Obviously, like it's much more complex in reality, but and the same is true for any abusive system, right? So if you look at the police, right, you look at the state, right, you look at capitalism, you look at these systems of manipulation and abuse, right? They also tell you the ways in which they're weak, right? By showing you who they target.
Yeah.
Right? So looking at the fact that, the state targets houseless folks, right?
Yeah.
The state targets houseless folks partially because the only function of the state is the protection of private property. All states across the board, either everything within the realm of the state either directly enforces private property, or enforces the property rights of a specific class. In so-called communist countries, it's the bureaucratic class, and the capitalist countries, it's the bourgeoisie, right? And all other functions of the state either directly do that, or they buttress it, or they perpetuate a mythology that's not what they do, right? Or like something like any other thing, right? But it's all about that, right? And so like houseless folks create spaces like around themselves by necessity, by existence, that are autonomous, right? Because they don't have that. They don't have a space, right? They're always technically like loitering or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So the state must attack them, right? Which is why the state will never be able to solve houselessness, right? So like, of course, if you want to attack the state, all you have to do is help houseless people. Help. Just to exist and be less harmed by the system, right?
Yeah.
The same thing, like that's why, that's historically why the state wanted to annihilate and continues to try to annihilate indigenous people, right, and native people, right, is that like there's an alternative system and they must destroy that system and destroy all people involved with that system, right?
Destroy the language.
Yeah, which is, that's like an interesting thing in and of itself as well, right? And the same thing of like, if we look at, prisons, they're full of people who commit property crimes, or, people who are, serve as a, basically like serve as a warning, right, that are terrorized on behalf of other people, right, to terrorize the middle class, or to maintain the function of the state, to maintain the story of police as a valid institution.
Most liberals openly admit that a healthy welfare state is what is needed for capitalism to continue to exist.
Absolutely.
And that's basically their fucking... That's like... central to their political philosophy.
At this point, the like primary way of saving capitalism is going to be universal basic income.
Yeah,
that's it. Period.
And healthcare. It's the Nordic model.
Yeah, totally. And so again, like if we want to undermine, the state, we want to undermine the institution, like that institution, like then the one of the important things that we can do is undermine the narrative of the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, right? And by talking about the ways in which the legal system has harmed me by giving my attackers a platform, also giving my potentially creating the situation in which the people who attack me would feel safe attacking me and feel safe attacking others, right? That it is the inverse of justice, that it perpetuates violence and extends violence, like that it will continue to extend violence, right? This will not go away, but rather this will continue to expand and accelerate as automation continues, as communication continues, as we accelerate, as we become more insular in many ways, like our communities, like we can choose our communities and algorithms feed back into driving beliefs in a very specific direction. We will all atomize and radicalize towards our own directions, right? Like we will see all of the things that we're seeing now get worse, right? Unless we take responsibility and we figure out how to do things in a completely different way. And part of that is attacking all of the stories, right? It's the narratives, it's the stories that maintain these structures, because all of this shit is just made up anyway. Right?
Borders are in the mind.
Right? And if we can do that, then we may survive.
Totally. So what I was kind of getting at with the precedent thing, though, do you think that there's any opportunity in the case to push the restorative narrative or the restorative issue, because that could be you don't even know there's that inkling, that tiny little seed of potential where it could there could be a precedent set towards a more restorative.
I think it's less. It's
something.
It's less within the court system, right? What the court's going to do what it's going to do, and in terms of we've already made progress in terms of talking about restorative justice, and people have already started talking about that outside. I think one of the things that I heard in the hospital that made me feel really good was the person. This person's a Christian in the Eastern Washington or something like that. His house was robbed. He's an older guy. I think he said basically my beliefs are about forgiveness. I would like to talk about restorative justice, and I heard about this thing, and I want to know more about it, and asked the police department to do something about it, and they were just we don't know what to do.
We just know how to put people in a cell. That's what we do.
And so I think we're starting to expose the limits, right? And at the same time, me talking to the prosecutors, right? Saying hey, this is what I want, has driven them to start to talk about and think about other things, right? And so they have investigated and are investigating, and for this situation, the reality is we're probably not going to see restorative justice. That's probably not going to happen. And we probably won't see it for several times. But we may see youth diversion programs start happening, which are the basis of it. The ending the youth jail here, right? So there's the
new one, that's
the new youth jail, right? Zero youth incarceration is the beginning of reducing our mass incarceration system. But we also have to keep in mind that even the right is against mass incarceration, not because it's unethical, but because it's not efficient, it's more efficient to incarcerate you in your house with
Right.
tracking devices and like et cetera, et
Really?
cetera. Right. So like anything that we do, like we have to remember that like anything we do, no matter like how, I kind of view it from the perspective of like it's harm reduction, right? Like I think that it's if we can reduce youth incarceration, for example, via diversion programs, that makes, on the one hand, that makes the state more tolerable. Right. Because it's not like it's slightly less obviously awful, right? Like not putting children in prison, like maybe that, right? And so there's the harm reduction side of it, but like we also have to remember that like that it does, it will be used in a reactionary way in anything that we do, right? Any positive movement that we make, short of like completely ending the state, right? Like, and that's that's another one of the really difficult challenges to think about. And so
there's always going to be pushback.
Yeah, and I think that also like this, at some point this will become like, this too will be integrated into the story of America if it lasts long enough. Like, oh, look at how enlightened we are. We're doing this. Restorative justice thing.
In typically American fashion, I think that we started it. When other countries have been doing things like their prison population is like nothing, and they have these like
much
rehabilitation
better
programs that are
So, but I do think it'll happen. I mean, I'm pretty confident that it'll change. I just hope that like we'll also be able to maintain the momentum against all the rest of these systems, against police, against like. Right. All the systems of oppression.
Yeah. So is there another, any other cases besides this fellow in Eastern Washington, or?
There are some folks currently resisting some of the grand jury stuff in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of information about that. That would be something that's way beyond anything that I've done, right? Like, because what we're talking about is like I didn't really like have to put anything on the line. The state was going to prosecute anyway.
Right. It's out of your hands.
Like, there's not, right. Whereas like they're actively, there are potentially people actively resisting, state oppression, like on behalf of their attackers, right? And that's incredible. And so there's that. There are people who just don't want to participate in the state in any way to reinforce it at all. And I think
because they can come back. It also
and there's also
the more they're going to give information that the state is going to use against leftists and against that's a really big thing. It's just like. I think one of the things I kind of mentioned is like the first thing that I said, I did give a police statement that was basically like, I didn't see who shot me. I don't really remember very much about what happened. I thought it was you. I did tell them that I thought it was the police who had shot me first, if my memory serves me correctly. So I mean, like of course. They're going to use, like, of course that's going to happen. Of course that's going to happen. Of course, like, the state is going to, use any information they get to attack us, and they have historically. And that's really one of the things, like, our enemies in blue comes, like, pretty clearly, even while, for example, the FBI was supposedly infiltrating the Ku Klux Klan, right?
Right.
They sent in an informant, so-called supposed informant, who then informed the Klan of FBI activity,
right.
And gave the location of things like, freedom riders that, were murdered by, the Klan, more or less at the direction of the FBI.
Yeah, it became an information pipeline, right?
Yeah. So, like, it's an interesting thing, right? And like the FBI was set up to murder anarchists. That was like
the FBI was set up to destroy the left.
Specifically, it was set up to hunt down anarchists.
Yeah.
So like it was set up as a reaction to the McKinley assassination by an anarchist, and the stated purpose was basically like find and kill all the anarchists. So like that's, we were talking about like its founding, right? Like that there are foundational institutions of the state that exist to like murder people like me. Right? Like, there's really no room for peace, in that kind of equation there. Cooperation at the end of the day. But at the same time, right? We also have. We also do have legal mechanisms that we can use, and occasionally we do win. And there are things, for example, here in the state of Washington, there is the Washington State Public Records Act, which can be used to get information. It's one of the best public records acts. I think it's it's like the Washington and Florida basically have some of the best public records.
Florida,
I know it, right? Which the reason actually is one of the reasons for Florida Man, by the way. Turns out
Florida Man.
Yeah, so like
Florida Man.
So like the whole thing of like some crazy thing happened. Florida Man today, like crazy thing, right?
I don't know what the hell you're talking about.
The whole meme, yeah.
It's like all the news headlines always say Florida man,
Okay.
like does a like crazy murder.
Yeah, eats somebody's face was one of them.
Eats somebody's face.
Yeah, so Florida Man.
This is a bath salts thing.
That was the best. Yeah. Okay. So Florida Man exists because there is a really good public records law in Florida that lets people lets news stations just request all the craziest things, and then they go filter it out, and they find like the one that they want, and then they whatever.
It's overwhelmingly in the favor of those who are making the request.
Yeah, exactly.
That basically, all public information has to be.
Yeah, so Washington has very similar laws, and we absolutely can and should use those to, for example, identify Nazis in the police departments or things like that. Also, like as people, if you're in colleges, and you're using EDU emails and things like that, just be aware that public records requests, can apply to a lot of different things. And so, be very careful and thoughtful about what, because this was actually recently used against some folks at Evergreen to identify leftist speakers and get basically information on house locations for I think it was homes of leftist speakers who had gone to speak for this one radical group. So if you're organizing, if you're operating under a club at a university, at a state funded institution, keep in mind that public records acts can potentially get access to any information that you have that you keep under the name of the institution. This can be used both ways, right? And should be.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think that there's a lot of room. I think that's a really unexplored place because historically, we have avoided interacting with state power and using state power or anything like that because it's gross, right? And we're honest. We say things that we mean,
consistent with our beliefs,
right? And so that's the thing that allowed, for example, Trump was able to he just says whatever the fuck he wants, right? And a lot of the right they say and do whatever they want. And one of at least part of that segment, right? Their goals are to establish a religious fascist country, right? And so they'll say whatever they think that they can use to get away with disabling some helpful section of the government that keeps people from murdering people or expanding laws that allow people to murder people or whatever, right? They'll do anything that they can to expand, for example, stand your ground, in certain cases, for example, stand your ground is used to murder people, right? And that's actually that's basically like there's a variant of stand your ground here, which is the argument that they were using to claim that they were right in shooting me, right? Because she was
I was going to ask
scared.
about that. Yeah.
Basically was the argument, and so if she could pretend to be scared, then she can go ahead and shoot people.
Yeah.
That's fucking dangerous, right? But this the right is really good at finding things like that we might call one-way doors, right? A one-way door is basically a thing where if we can get a piece of legislation through, like there's no going back, right? And so this is the thing that like Reagan really did well, like in terms of like dismantling all the protections of, all of the potentially good things, right? And like privatization. Privatization is a one-way door. Right, because as soon as you privatize something, you can't ever nationalize it again because
that's socialism.
Right. Well, it's not only that it's socialism; it's also that just the mechanisms for doing that are easier to fight in court than privatizing it. Right. So you open yourself to legal things if you try to nationalize a thing. Right. So if we can identify, legislation that we could pass that makes things harder for police to exist or to arm themselves or to attack people or to things like that. It's not the solution.
No.
But that is one thing that we could potentially use. And so what the right did, right, is on the one hand, attacked unions using the law and things like that, broke up unions, built out and militarized the police, all of these things, right? And then at the same time, built their own private militaries, collapsed the state, right? So
that's what they're doing right now.
Yeah. So they're
dismantling every agency from the inside.
Arm the fuck out of the police because the police are fascist, right? Police are the realization of fascism locally everywhere, right? And they're also beholden directly to basically directly to Trump because there are military grants and things like that, right? So they circumvent local government.
The mayor is technically their boss,
right? But they never actually. If the mayor was really their boss, here in all of the laws against surveillance equipment that they've been breaking for the past several years here in Seattle would actually be possible to enforce. But of course they aren't, right? Because they work directly for Trump and federal government, and actually
the NDAA,
DHS. So they're because of the way that funding works.
After 9/11,
DHS directly took control of all local police, and all local police have become more and more militarized and are basically a local army. Right. So you have the militia movement, right? So you have the destruction of welfare state and all social services and things like that. The militia movement picks up from that. In some places, they will remove police and the militia will take over completely, right? And in other places, they'll build up the police. Places where we live, they'll build up the police as a military force to suppress us.
Yeah.
And so they've been using both sides, right? They'll build a militia and at the same time they'll have the police attack unions, right? Because they don't have to have the militia attack unions, right? And there's really no reason we couldn't do the same thing.
Right. The left is pretty historically, it's by the nature of, because we are philosophically consistent, don't want to utilize the state and the levers of the state by any means.
Right.
But
because and we don't want to be inconsistent, right? But it's what? Fuck it. Because they're gonna murder us.
Shoot ourselves in the foot.
Yeah.
By not using it all of the above sort of tactical.
Yeah. Every means at our disposal.
Yeah.
Right. And of course it's always gonna be skewed and it's always there's all these things, but they also don't expect us. Right? They never expect us to use the state. Right? Yeah. Because why would we use the state?
Yeah.
It's inconsistent with our beliefs. Of course, there are problems, right? We can't, infiltrate the police, right? Because
I'm not going to become a cop.
Nobody's going to be nobody's going to become a cop.
Yeah.
And B, we're just not the same, right? It's easier for the fash to infiltrate the police
because they already have, because that's where they started, right?
That's what they stand for.
Yeah, because police are as slave patrols are consistent with like white supremacists, et cetera, right? But we can, work to, disarm, defund, disband, like, et cetera. We can work for like reform, like within the system, while simultaneously attacking the state, like make space for ourselves as much as possible.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, I mean, like fundamentally, we have to build our own institutions to the greatest degree that we possibly can, right? And then everything else is like, another tactic that we can use. Any way that we can build our own institutions external to the state, right? That are controlled by us, by the community, by anarchists, by like, local folks, like whatever.
Too many anarchists have like an all or nothing sort of.
Yeah, anarchists, like, they believe, they're all about, like, smash the state, and we have to, like, we have to have no state, whatever, and, like, leave all of the reform up to, like, people who are willing to liberals who are going to do it, and then, like, be, like, glad it's there, but, like, refuse to acknowledge that, like, you gotta take what you can get, and you gotta fight for every corner of it.
I think the main thing is, like, not wanting to fall into the trap of reformism, because, like, it is fucking bullshit. It is, like, it's gonna kill us. And, like, we can do better than reformism, but we can use, I think that we can use the state to establish space, like, for ourselves, right? Like, that we can use the state to, for example, like try to get funds for a project, right?
Or
like,
a $15 minimum wage.
That's there. The more that we're expropriating wealth from like the capitalist system, like the more money that we get, in wages, right? If we are, if we can possibly put any of that extra, or if we have any extra, if we like whatever, we can expropriate that from the capitalist system. Anytime that we can use laws to like sue cops, right? Like if we can like sue police departments, like then we potentially partially defund, like we take money from them, we expropriate it, and we put it into our community. Right. That's a fucking win. Like that is as good as storming a police station and taking it over, right? Like half as good. But I mean, like, it's real value. It's better than lighting a cop car on fire, right? Because at the end of the day, you get the cop car, right? Like, you expropriate the thing, you could buy your own cop car, right? If you, for just a fun, crazy idea, if, 20, 30 people decided to get together and start a town out in the middle of nowhere, they could start create a fake police department, create a police department legally, and start requesting arms from the federal government, right? Because they're police. Right? There's all kinds of crazy things that we haven't done, we haven't started thinking about, and haven't started talking about, like that we could be doing to build up a counterpower, our own counterpower to like right-wing authoritarianism and the state, right?
There's such a lack of that kind of creativity, it seems like.
Well, I mean, part of it, I think, is just that we're terrified, right? We're continually under attack, and we can't I think this is a thing that I've kind of noticed from the PTSD, right? A little bit is over the course of the past year, everything's gotten very, very close, right? And I've been focusing on very much focusing on survival. I think I spend a lot of time in my head, right? Thinking about theory or things that I can't reach or things that I can are not either things that are immediate or are not achievable. Right? And the more that I'm for a while I was in a space where I could relax and, have a vision of very clear ways that we can go from, where we are at to something better. Right? And, so things for example, supporting houseless camps, right? Just by asking what's needed, identifying things that can be brought, picking up trash, identify things that get here, right? Identify things that get camps swept and solve those.
So they can
pick up trash.
To live there.
Yeah, to exist, to fortify, right, and to be able to carve out autonomous spaces within this system, right? Yeah. And if we can, they're only going to grow. Capitalism isn't going to solve housing. I mean, we know this. We know this.
which means
there's 10 empty houses for every homeless person. Or
oh
something.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
fucking
totally. And
ridiculous.
it's going to get worse, right?
It's just gonna get worse.
And so we know capitalism isn't going to solve this problem. We know it's only going to get worse. So if we build the institutions in a way, so if we build our institutions in a way that we support folks, right? We also know that like we know that FEMA is going to continue to be underfunded, right? We know that like our disaster preparedness, like national disaster preparedness, is going to continue to be worse and worse at the same time as natural disasters are going to continue to be more and more catastrophic and larger, right? Which is going to lead back into the homeless problem, right? Like the houseless problem again, right? And so one of the things we also know, if we look, for example, at Syria, right, is that very authoritarian, top-down authoritarian countries are extremely unstable.
Yeah.
Right? They're not resilient to natural disaster, which means that when a natural disaster strikes, if there is an organization that is capable of picking up, like, and establishing infrastructure, right, that organization becomes the default authority.
Yeah.
Right, and if that organization happens to be anarchist,
Like in Rojava.
then
or Rojava.
Rojava, then the police don't ever get to come back.
Yeah.
The state never gets to come back, and that's what we have in northern Syria right now,
Yeah.
right? And also the state, can never attack those types of institutions. Can never, in the early stages, like if you were building a disaster preparedness network, the state can't attack the disaster preparedness network, right?
Not even inclined to.
Yeah, it isn't even interested in. In fact, most of the time, they work together in coordination with the state, right? So like, hey, get to know your, local, disaster preparedness folks.
Totally.
Don't necessarily work with them or don't necessarily work with the state, but like understand, right? Like autonomous answers to some of these things. Like ultimately, like the state relies on like autonomous and decentralized like systems anyway. Like in China and
Occupy Sandy was one like when Hurricane Sandy hit New York. It was like one of the more powerful responses.
Yeah, exactly.
And the community completely just stepped up for itself, and there was like,
and this
big old banner just Occupy Sandy. I mean, like all that political energy
and this
manifested itself very quickly.
Exactly.
Overnight.
Exactly. Right. And this, these kinds of things fundamentally undermine the story of the state.
Yeah.
Right. And
Its necessity.
Yeah. The more that we can answer all of these questions, like a well-formed, a well-constructed disaster preparedness network is indistinguishable from a revolutionary movement.
Yeah.
And it's important to think about that, especially right now.
And it's important to think about like the sort of delegation of a society's needs too. Like why is it that the same force that wears riot gear is the one that you call when your car gets stolen?
Right. Right.
They don't necessarily. We have this idea that these things are the same. That
Right.
They require the same. But why is it the same organization?
Yeah.
Yeah. It
Right.
shouldn't be. You don't need to
makes
call
no
the
sense.
same
There's
number
no-
necessarily when your cat's stuck in the tree as when your house is.
I mean, and
burning
of course,
down.
and that's and that's why that like that's why more and more people are being like killed by the police, right? And like. So that's one part of it. It's like more and more people are getting called, right? And the police are being continually like more and more militarized, right? Speaking of which, a fun public records request is watch the movie Do Not Resist, and make public records requests for what is it? DLA.gov, Defense Logistics Agency. And for I believe it's Grossman's Bulletproof Warrior. Bulletproof Warrior is a training seminar that teaches police to be more comfortable murdering people.
Wow.
So there's clips from it in the Do Not Resist documentary.
This is Washington State.
This is all over the country.
So how does that work with public records requests
So
through the state?
in the state of Washington, we can request anything belonging to the state, or below.
Or below, okay.
right? So we cannot request federal stuff unless it falls inside of things like the Fusion Center, or there's some collaboration between the state and federal government. So, for example, like DLA is a collaboration between the Department of Defense and local police. That collaboration is subject to public records requests in Washington because, you know, every email back and forth is going to be in the, it's going to be on the
state servers.
Yeah, exactly, right. So if, you know, obviously if the state deletes the, you know, email, you can't get it from the federal government unless you use a FOIA, which is a completely different thing.
Totally other class of.
Yeah, but so like we do have some of these tools. You know, if you know, anytime you are stopped by a cop, like, you know, do a public records request on the event. Make sure that the thing that you like that happened is the same as what you remember experiencing, right? If you see a vehicle parked at a police station that, you know, may belong to an officer that has, like, you know, racist shit on it, right? Like, or like, you know, like Blue Lives Matter or like whatever. Like, you know, maybe look up the license plate and try to figure out who owns it, and then do a public records request for that cop.
Wow,
right?
Yeah, and then everything they've ever done.
Yeah, and so the
is subject to being requested.
Yeah, so remember that one of the things is that, like, if you are making a request like this, there's two tactics, right? One is that they deny it, or they find some way to, like, stonewall you and try to get you to not actually, you know, pursue it, you know, or they tell you it's going to take a long time, or like something like that, right? And the other is to give you so much information that you can't possibly go through it all. Yeah. Right. So, like, you know, you'll ask for, like, hey, give me this, you know, such and such a thing. They may say, like, oh, I don't know what that is, right? They have to respond to you within 5 days, by the way. And so they may say, oh, I don't know what that is, or they may ask for, like, specific things to try and narrow it down. And then if you, like, request, like, every record on this, they'll just send you so much stuff that you can't possibly go through it. Yeah. So you want to look for, you know, complaints, and you want to look for, like, things like that. OPA reports, the Office of Professional Accountability, I think, or Police Accountability, depending on the department that you're in, are good ones. So, like, if you are stopped, for example, like, request every OPA report related to it, and also request, you know, your, like, you know, all the stops within an hour of your, all reports on the stops within an hour of your stop, or something along the lines of that.
If there wasn't specifically, like, a mention of your name.
Or, like, or like, hey, you know, if you know what the car is, you know, you'll know your name. You can look up your report on that as well. But yeah, if you were just to ask, like, every record on officer so and so, they'd send you everything potentially, or they'd be like, oh, we need to, like, redact, you know, all everything that's ever been done. So we'll send you that, and, you know, I have a friend who made a request. You know, for something similar to that, and he should be caught up by today in, like, 2050 or something along the lines of that, because they have to redact a bunch of things, obviously. Right?
And so when they commit to it, but it's going to take that long, then they're compliant, so they can't get sued, right?
It depends. It depends.
But that's also a tactic. So if you can prove that was the tactic that was being used in court, then you, right?
If you can show that they're, like, but anyway, this goes into, like, a whole bunch of
talking about other shit. But
that's it's definitely a thing to, like, research. If you you know, again, like, this is a great legal tool, right? That we can use to get information, and should be using more. This is, like, one of the things where, like, there's actually a law that, you know, accidentally somehow, and, like, they continue to try to repeal it. You know, which is why they're continuing to try to repeal it. Like, it actually works, right? Like, for example, like, there was a minimum cost, right? It was like $5 per record or something along the lines of that. You know, per day.
Per record per day.
Yeah, so if you're
compensated for it.
That you're compensated for if they don't, like, so if you sue them, and, you know, which I think that ended up dropping to $0 minimum, right? But again, it's, you know, still usually above that. So, like, you know, they're always going to try to, like, dismantle any law that works.
So there's this, could be a burgeoning industry for a lot of pro bono lawyers too.
Oh yeah. Too. So that's anybody looking to get into suing the cops. And there's also like there's tons of public institutions that like are open to this. Institutions that haven't been like looked at. It's always worth like trying to figure out how things work, right? Like how exactly, for example, like do the sweeps work? Right? Mm-hmm. What are all the pieces to it? And like there was some stuff around the Olympia blockade where some public records requests had actually helped inform more about like tactics and strategies. I won't go into that.
Right, okay.
It was I think it was on I think there was like an interview on It's Going Down, or it might have been Soulcast. I don't remember. I think it was Soulcast actually, where some of the folks talked about how public records requests had been used to drive their tactics a little bit.
Yeah.
And so like this is a really, really great tool that we have, and we should absolutely use it as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, before they fucking take it away.
Before they take it away.
But it's less likely to get taken away the more people use it. In some ways, like
yeah, if it works, they'll try to take it away.
Right. But you've also got you've got mainstream journalists on your side in this case too, that are it's like hugely beneficial to the media to be able to request public records. So
yeah,
actually have some industry on your side as well.
I mean that's another thing is like also to think about ways in which like we could pit industries against each other, or like because like I mean like one of the things that I think people forget a lot is like anarchists forget a lot is that the state and capitalism is not like a monolithic thing, right?
Yeah.
There are some ways in which the state and the state exists primarily to prop up capitalism, but occasionally it ends up in opposition to some subsets of capitalism. So like it's used by one institution to attack another institution, or it needs to maintain the illusion that it's supported by the people or whatever. Right. So it'll attack some capitalist institution.
The state is theoretically the means by which people hold the market accountable.
Right. It's the narrative, right? So it has to maintain the narrative, right? In order to continue to exist. So occasionally it has to attack capitalist institutions.
Yeah.
And so remembering that, we can use that, right? Like we can occasionally just like claim that the narrative is valid, or make statements as though the narrative were valid in support of some say harm reduction thing, or some kind of like thing that undermines the power of the state, right?
Yeah.
And we kind of have to we have to do that, or I think that we have to do that. I could be wrong, I guess.
They'll sell us the rope to hang them with, or whatever. It's like
I mean, right?
Yeah.
You can get a shop to 3D print us guillotines. And I mean, yeah, right. Like that is what the capitalists that is what capitalism will do, right?
Yeah.
And
it's actively sowing. That Marx was probably correct about that. That it's capitalism will sow the seeds for its own demise, but he was off by 120 years probably.
Yeah. I think it's gonna be interesting. And there's another thing that I totally come back to talk about was also the amount of invisible labor and stuff that happened.
Invisible labor?
Yeah. So there was there's this thing in the Art of War, right? It's something along the lines of for every person who's in the field, there are 7 that are not can't do the things that they would normally do. They have to provide some sort of support role. right? And so like, historically, in cases like this, or like, soldiers who come back, like, the stories usually like focus on the individual, right? Like that was hurt or whatever. Where like the amount of like support was like really, really huge.
Yeah.
When I was in the hospital, my mother-in-law came out to like advocate for me, right? Like, cause like if it had just been me, right? Like I was just like I was high on opiates. Like, I had no idea what any of this stuff meant or any of these, like, so I had no ability to like really navigate the system, right? I didn't want to talk to the police without a lawyer because like you don't, right? And so like it was friends, it was family, it was like people close to me who like went and took care of that. And there were like a lot of things that I was like, hey, I need this thing, and people took care of that. And like I don't remember most of that, right? Because like opiates, right? But there was like a huge amount of support. So like just within that directly supporting me, right? And that is like even in a lot of like interviews and things like and in stories and whatever, like that's not something that's been talked about, right? The level of like disruption there. And the amount of extra labor that went into that, right? So like I had a $500,000 hospital bill, I think, by the end of it.
Wow. Jesus.
Which was, insurance and people raising money and like various things. Like things are good now, but like it's kind of crazy that like that. But anyway. So I was fortunate enough to not have to worry about that due to, like lots of people doing fundraising, due partially to like some of our GDC folks setting up, a fundraiser, right?
Yeah.
To like other folks like spreading that to like, and like I said, like, my mother-in-law was like doing support in the hospital, like helping, me navigate the system and understand and like be able to like do things and working with, and so like, she was like doing huge amounts of work there, right? Like full time,
right.
To support me. My partner was there like all the time, like taking care of me, and then going home, right? And like, being taken care of also by other people, right? And so like there's this there's some interesting stuff, right? Because like, and some stuff we should probably talk about, right? Where like there's this romanticization of like insurrectionary action, right, against police and things like that, or whatever, right, or against like the right, where somebody will put themselves in danger and will be harmed or killed or something like that, like happened to me.
Made a martyr.
Yeah, and on the one hand, like I have experienced a lot of like physical trauma. And like a lot of like being in the hospital was really traumatic, right? But like at the end of the day, also like had I been, killed, it would have been, like a lot of femme presenting folks who would have been like taking care of the community, doing a lot of emotional labor, and that would have been erased because it would have been me, right? That everybody looked at, right? Not all of the people who actually cleaned up or provided support or did like any of these things, right? Using my platform to kind of like dismantle my own platform a little bit, right? Is that like, there's this whole community, right? And as much as people like have looked to me, and as much as like I have tried to use this, this platform to forge, ends like dismantling the prison system and stuff like that, right? It is also that
there's another whole thing, another whole reality that's been invisible, has been under the surface of like the labor, the trauma to the community, right? That a lot of people organizing in Seattle have experienced. You know, some were standing next to me.
Yeah.
You know, some were on top of me, holding my wound.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm telling the story. You know, but there's like this
whole network.
Yeah, whole network of people, and you know, so like I'm, you know, also at the same time, like I'm saying, like I want restorative justice for myself, right? But it's also important to recognize that like restorative justice is about accountability for everybody,
benefit of everyone.
To everybody,
Yeah.
right? And so there are all these people that like I'm getting to speak for, but I'm, you know, not actually in a position to speak for what their experiences and their traumas and their things, and like, so it's a lot more complex than, you know, you know, I went out and got shot and, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
And that's just another like layer of things that we, you know, have to look at and dismantle and figure out how to even think about. But
So from that, like, you know, because of your position, so like the left is fucking paranoid.
yeah,
Historically,
for good
necessarily
reason,
paranoid, right?
yeah, because we get murdered regularly.
We get murdered, and leftist organizations get infiltrated. Like,
All
it's
the
just
time,
a
yeah.
guarantee.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, that's why the FBI was fucking founded, you know?
yeah.
So now, what happened to you? Like, basically proves that you're trustworthy.
I mean, so, to some people.
To a lot of people, I think.
But right, but it proves that, but it doesn't
Not a
prove
lot
that
of
like
people, not a lot of fucking undercover agents are gonna get shot on purpose just to fucking heavily infiltrate the Wobblies.
but man, if they did.
So, but like, don't you think? So that's just like a guarantee that it's gonna make you a focal point
Yeah.
for people who are desperate to trust,
Yeah, yeah.
desperate for trust.
And I mean, like, and I don't know how to solve that one either, right? Like, I don't know how to solve really pretty much any of these, but
Yeah.
and maybe that's the thing too, is just like, you know, maybe I'm like trying to figure out how to solve things that are not mine to solve.
Like as a conduit, and that's just fine.
Yeah. I mean,
Like,
like,
it's not-
I think
like,
that's
you could be
fine, but
reluctant
also,
about it,
I think to some degree that's fine, but also like there are a bunch of other people who went through experiences, and like, and those experiences are not visible, right?
Yeah.
And I don't even know how to begin to like approach, you know, the fact that like people, you know, look at me and think of the things that like, you know, I sacrifice, but, you know, often don't look at, you know, my partner or listen to my partner and think about the things that like, you know, they've sacrificed and the things that they've experienced, and like the ways in which like, you know, maybe, you know, I mean, like the thing, like going out and like, you know, trying to like de-escalate and whatever, right? You know, I did that without, you know, without backup, right? Because like that's what I was where I was at, and like I, you know, was just like, oh, I'm gonna go to this thing.
Yeah, it wasn't an organized.
Yeah, it wasn't like really
marshaled or something kind of.
And so like in doing that, right? I put myself in danger and put, you know, a lot of, you know, exposed a lot of people to trauma, and like that's something that's not something that we've talked about.
Yeah.
Right. You know, the traumatic experience that I went through and other people have gone through and like have exposed other people to, right, is something that's like not necessarily something that I have to clean up or deal with. Whereas like there are a lot of people who are doing that, and, you know, their stories are not being necessarily told.
Yeah.
Right.
So I don't know how to even approach talking about that or dealing with that.
Well, you are.
This person said something about like, doesn't spend 75% of the time building, and 25%, tearing the systems down that,
Oh yeah.
and like, when we experience really intense trauma, right? Like my immediate reaction or immediate feeling is like to figure out how to like defend myself, how to protect myself, how to like tear this thing down that's like literally tried to murder me.
Yeah.
It tries to murder my friends, right? Like, what do I do to stop it? What do I do to kill the thing that's attacking us, right? And, that's not really useful. Partially just because, like, there's no way that I can ever really focus on that while I'm, like, this traumatized and fucked up, right?
Yeah.
But also that, like, the way in which we liberate ourselves, the way in which we do the thing that we want to do, the way in which we, like, kill the monster that's attacking us, right, is to, like, do the things that we've never done, right? It's not to, like, go and, like, throw yourself in the way of the legal system or throw yourself in the way, like, unless it's useful, right? Like, but, it's not to just, like, go get arrested, right? Like, that doesn't, that costs the community money.
Burn a cop car.
It costs, right? Like, they may feel great, it may feel like you're doing something, but like, and maybe it does something, I don't know. Maybe I'm not in the right position to like say, but like, the thing that more than anything we need to do is figure out what are the ways that we can build things that the state could never build. Because if we can build things that the state and capitalism could never build, right? Then we have it. We have that thing. Mm-hmm. And like, we've proved to ourselves that we can do things, and we've proved to others that we can do things. Like, we legitimize ourselves, right? Building disaster preparedness networks, supporting like houseless folks, like providing, prison support, like just right to prisoners, like just doing that.
Just reminding them that they're not alone.
Yeah. Like that alone changes, that's gonna have a more intense impact, and maybe a longer term impact than being arrested. Yeah. Sometimes you do that. Sometimes that's what you do. Sometimes that's the right thing to do. And I'm not gonna say don't do the thing that's right for you in your situation, your tactics, but also remember that these aren't isolated. Yeah. Right. So like, me going out and getting shot potentially like is useful and powerful. Like that was like, I wouldn't take it back. And it was useful.
That's where I was going a little bit.
Yeah. No, I mean, like I wouldn't take it back. Right. Like I think that like, and I think this is my therapist. I was talking to my therapist, and he's like a liberal, basically. Like I like the guy, but he's like a liberal. So like, we were having this conversation about like, a thing, and then he like, asked me about, what if I could go back in time and I could, say something to myself before I got shot, like what, like what would you say to yourself, when you're, getting ready to go out the door, like what would you say to yourself? And I said, well, like, wear a vest.
Yeah. It was a body shot.
Yeah, like I mean, I didn't have a vest, so probably like, duck, I guess, or something. Don't duck, because that would have been worse. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, like, it's kind of like telling him basically, like, realistically, if I could see myself afterwards, like, I would have been much more reassured and would have just been more comfortable going out there, right? Because like, I didn't know whether I was going to survive. Right, like we had like on the calendar, it was just like my partner and I were just like looking at it on the calendar. There was like doom written on January 20th because we like didn't know, and like it was actually we had talked to people about how dangerous the potentially was. We knew prior to that, there was a Nazi rally that like had ended up with a bunch of like counter protesters being stabbed, right? Like this was like the context of what we're.
Wait, when was that?
June. It was like June 2016.
2016. Okay.
Yeah. So like the
Is that
context.
the one in Sacramento?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
So like the context of this was like fascist violence, racist, rising to power, Nazi collaborator who now we have the all the receipts, like coming to campus, bringing Nazis to campus. It became a rally point for Nazis, right?
Yeah.
And were the Nazis going to come out and stab people? Were they going to shoot people? Were the cops just going to open fire because they were like, it's Trump time, we can just shoot whoever we want now, right? Like, 'cause nobody's going to stop us, right? Like, what was going to happen, right? We had no idea what was going to happen, and and so like if I could have come back and seen myself and known that I had survived, I'd be like, good, cool. Yeah. I'm definitely going. Like, I feel much more comfortable now. I may have worn a different jacket probably.
You lost your jacket.
I would have worn boots that I didn't like as much. I guess like things like this, right? No, I wouldn't have like not gone. There's a situation now that we can talk about victims and victimization and the ways in which the state participates in re-victimizing people and the ways in which the legal system does not work, right, while claiming to work. And we have a platform to talk about all this stuff, and that's valuable, right? At the same time, the cost of that has been, a lot of people, a lot of PTSD, a lot of like emotional damage, a lot of like things that are really invisible. And that's the cost, right? And it's a cost that I haven't carried as much as a lot of other people in the community, right? So I say I totally would do that again, right? Or wouldn't do that again ever, but I would have done that, I wouldn't undo it, right? Yeah. That's also, part of that is also that I haven't had to pay all of the cost of it, right? And so that's the thing, as we're moving forward and as we're thinking about things, when we're thinking about strategic actions to take that may put our lives in danger, right? Sometimes that's the right thing to do, but don't forget that that's not the only thing that's happening. That's not it.